Proportional Response. Book 1, Chapter 15, Part 3, Floating in Defiance. Inibal sat in his booth in the council chambers, wishing Caslor could have magically arrived since he and Henry had gotten drunk the day before yesterday. Henry had given him a day to get things in order, which had been hard to do with the portion of his hangover that modern medical science couldn't quite dispel. He'd gotten it done though with calls to Her Majesty, half a dozen vendor grain brokers, and several farming consortiums, both within the Empire and in several other nations. Thankfully, Her Grace Golnar had agreed to go to the meeting with Kilintar for him, and reported that it went exactly as Henry said it would. The Sultan had denied everything out one side of his snout, while assuring her that they were working diligently to look into the issue with the other. She assured him that she'd given nothing away, and the lizard had no suspicions of what was about to happen. Inibal wasn't sure he could have sat through the meeting without trying to claw those reptilian eyes out. Definitely too much time around the humans. He watched the other councillors file in, all of them shooting annoyed glances at the feline Ruxa ambassador, who had called them into this emergency quorum. No one liked these special sessions, particularly when they were called on short notice. They tended to interrupt other business, or, worse, other entertainment. Figuring out who suspected the reason for the session posed no problem, though those affected by the grain issue looked slightly annoyed rather than nearly hostile. At length, the doors behind him cycled shut, and the locking bolt thudded home. Inibal checked the time on his console, down to the last moment, and not a second sooner. He felt a little proud of himself that he'd finally managed not to jump. The door for the Prime Minister remained closed. A murmur went up around the chambers, but he just folded his hands and put on his best neutral expression. Kilintar is violating the rules again, just to assert his authority. Such a petty little monster. He carefully studied Jalat out of the corner of his eye. Well, monsters. He does nothing without her order anymore, though most don't know that, and she is even more jealous of the Prime Minister's authority than Kilintar was, and I would never have believed that possible. At length, 10 seconds before someone would have had the chance to call for a vote of censure, the Prime Minister's door opened and Kilintar strutted up to the podium. A disquieted mutter ran through the room, but Inibal kept himself quiet. Kilintar stared down a few ambassadors as he strode towards his podium. Inibal turned slightly to look at Golnar and quirked an eyebrow, wordlessly asking a question. She pointedly glanced at Jalat, then back to him, and gave him a sly half grin, as if to say, "Oh, they have no idea what is coming. This should be fun." Inibal turned his attention back to Kilintar, his face calm but mind still churning. "I still want to know how Henry got the Ruxa to play their part. They are obligate carnivores, and eat very little that isn't meat. Why would they be that concerned about bad grain? Still, having them call this session was a masterful stroke." It took a lot of his concentration not to glance down at Henry, but he couldn't. That he had a close relationship with the man was no secret, but the special kinship they shared was. He couldn't allow himself to be seen taking cues from Henry, nor appearing to lean on the man for support. Kilintar took his time walking to the podium, then stood there staring back and forth at the assembled ambassadors for a while. It finally became apparent that he had no intention of speaking until he had everyone's undivided attention, and the various muttered conversations puttered off to silence. Once silence reigned, Kilintar lifted one eyebrow and took a last look around, as if daring anyone to speak. For some reason, all eyes seemed to go to Henry, but the man just sat there with a dark look on his face. Apparently satisfied, Kilintar spoke. "This begins the special session for grievance, as requested by the Ruxa ambassador and the Kismar government, then seconded by the Ronanar and the Baitha, and voted on by a sufficient number of ambassadors to force a call to quorum. Ambassador Telil, in accordance with the rules of this council, I give you the floor and allow you to address the council, despite the fact that you have not, as is customary in these sort of proceedings, provided the office of the Prime Minister with a copy of your grievance." Kilintar's eyes narrowed and a little gravel went into his voice. "Be aware that I have elected to record this session of the council and will be returning to this matter later if required. Enibel blinked in surprise at the naked threat in those words. But the Ruxa just nodded sagely, undocked his platform from the wall, and floated out to address the council. It took some effort to steal his own features as Kilintar's and Gillat's eyes narrowed. No one had used that feature of the platforms in a long time, not since one of them mysteriously malfunctioned after Kilintar had made it clear he found the things offensive and the offending ambassador fell to her death. That was the Ruxa ambassador, now that I think about it. Everyone knew Kilintar had been responsible, but no one said anything. To use that now, nice touch. Enibel watched as the half-circle of the platform slowly floated from its position about halfway up the council chamber's wall until it floated even with the Prime Minister's podium. The platforms, when docked to the wall, were 10-foot radius half-circles. Each ambassador put flooring to their own taste in the platform. Most went with generic black carpet, but the Ruxa had always used simulated lightstone. About a foot from the edge was a solid panel that came straight up from the floor to the approximate height of a typical desk for that species. A curved sheet of metal joined the top of that panel to the edge of the platform, and a screen, with controls in the language of the platform's species, sat at the front of the platform at just the right height for a seated ambassador to use. Each platform had a degree of customization to it beyond the carpeting, of course, particularly with that interface. His own interface was holographic, and he could control it just as well standing or sitting. Ambassador Talil Onsar had a similar upgrade to his interface, it appeared. The man stood straight, his hands at his sides, subtle movements of his hands guiding his platform. The Ruxa's tail relaxed behind him, and his whiskers quivered slightly, which Enibel knew mean the man was deliberately not turning to look at a perceived threat. I know that. How? When did I learn that? I guess I'm glad I spent so much time studying the micro-expressions of various species. He made a conscious effort to remember information on the Ruxa as he took a fresh look at the man standing on the floating platform. Like most Ruxa, Talil was tall, taller than the average Venter or human. They came from a slightly lower gravity world than his homeworld of Lornor, so that was hardly a surprise. Their fur coats tended to range from a dark brown to a ruddy orange, and Talil seemed to be more on the brown end of that spectrum. They also tended to have dark streaks that ran through their fur in intricate patterns, part of some sort of natural camouflage. They also tended towards minimal clothing, like a lot of species with full body coats of fur. He'd heard one or two of them complaining about fabric catching on their natural coat. Talil stood there, taking a moment to gauge his audience, as Enibel tried to read the man. That twitch of his hands, he is having to work to keep his claws sheathed, which could mean an attitude of attack or defense. Their primitive ancestors were ambush predators though, so the lowered tail means a preparation for an attack. His fur is down, and yes, that ear twitch. He knows Kilintar can't do anything, because it is vital for the Exultan that the Ruxa stay neutral in this war. They come from a high enough indexed world to be players on the battlefield, but the fact that they are natural predators adds to the danger they represent. Realization flashed across Enibel's mind. Onsar, the ambassador that Kilintar murdered, was named Onsar. I wish I could remember how their family name structures worked, but I know that Talil had to be related to the dead woman. Ruxa take their family relationships and vengeance very seriously. His government may refuse to get involved in the conflict, but this lets him strike at the Zoltan in general and Kilintar personally, while maintaining his nation's neutrality. Henry probably didn't have to do anything but present an opportunity to bloody Kilintar's nose. I wondered why the Ruxa changed out their ambassador last year. It had to have been a message to the Zoltan. Enibel smiled to himself. Looks like the Exultan didn't understand it, but I think they are about to. Talil pointedly refused to look at Kilintar as he addressed the council. My fellow sapiens, I thank you all for answering the summons to this special session and extend my regrets that the matter in question could not wait for a more normal hearing. The issue I wish for us to address is one of concern for several of you, and one which has the potential to be a biosphere-ending catastrophe for many worlds. Some months ago, several of our brokers, like many of yours, bought grain from the Exultan. They claimed the grain was acquired by right of conquest in their brief war with the humans. Recently, the fields with that grain have begun to rot, and nearby fields are being affected at an alarming rate. The grain which has been harvested from these fields is also tainted, and we have lost entire herds of food animals to it. Our scientists have determined that the rot is being caused by a microscopic fungus, and those findings have been confirmed by scientists of many of your nations. Once the issue and cause was confirmed, we contacted the Xultan and were rebuffed. When I met with the Xultan ambassador, she refused to acknowledge the issue and claimed she would look into it. We then appealed to the Feindel, since they are sometimes able to intercede with the Sultan where others are not. The esteemed Feindel ambassador was told that there had been developments since I asked for information and that the Xultan were working on the issue. They claimed they would have a solution to our blighted fields soon. That was many weeks ago, and the blight has continued to spread unchecked through our worlds, and yours, some to the point that they teeter on collapse.
Angry mutters spread through the council chamber. Enibal concentrated on Kilintar and Jalat in his peripheral vision. Both of them had hard, angry faces. Jalat had moved several times, obviously intending to call attention to herself, probably with the intent of trying to intimidate Talil. Enibal had to keep a smile off his face as he continued to study Kilintar. The lizard obviously wants to cut Talil's microphone and interrupt, but he can't. Talil undocking his platform and floating out was a threat, and it was against council rules for the Prime Minister to shut down an ambassador airing a grievance. Not that it would have stopped him in the past, but now any attempt to shut the Ruxa down would risk both pushing them to side with the humans and, worse, risk a vote of censure. Maybe even a vote of no confidence. And the Sultan certainly couldn't afford a vote for a new Prime Minister right now. Kilintar doesn't have to contend with another election for over a decade, barring a no-confidence vote, and everyone knows the war between the humans and the Sultans would be started and finished by then.